All right, well, welcome to the next edition of my series on quilt block tutorials, how to make basic things and then you can make them into bigger things. Let's talk about half square triangles. So we've made them two at a time. We've made them eight at a time, but what if you need a whole lot of identical half square triangles? There is a way to scale up from eight to, you know, 12, 16, 20, 24, whatever, make them a whole lot at one time. And this could come in handy. I've seen some blocks where you need to have like 36 half square, little teeny half square triangles that are all the same. So let's talk about how to scale up from, we've already scaled up from two half squares at a time to eight. We're going to scale up from eight up bigger. First off, let's go back over the standard things about my tutorials. As a general rule, I do my measurements exact. I don't normally have you make things oversized and then trim them down. This is one of those times, normal times, you're making things exact. All right. Also, remember, I don't like to sew unsupported bias seams because things can stretch. So we're cutting squares, we're not cutting triangles. And also, just a reminder that the standard practice in writing quilt patterns is to give dimensions in finished sizes, which is the size you see after it's sewn into your project. So the unfinished size, the size it is before you sew it in, is going to be the finished size plus the seam allowance all the way around. All right, so let's get started talking about half square triangles, 12 or more at a time. First of all, this method results in half square triangles in multiples of 4. So you get 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 30, etc. In this method, I'm going to have you draw a grid. You could draw directly on the fabric, but sometimes when the fabric pieces get that big and you're drawing that many lines, things move on you. So I prefer to draw on graph paper. You can draw on plain paper, but you've got to be careful of your angles. So I have some 1/4-inch gridded graph paper that I got from my local office supply store that works great. Also, this method, there are some commercially pre-printed interfacings that you can use to do this method, and they work great. They work just like this, and you don't have to draw your grid. But the downside on that is, say you need 3-inch half square triangles this month. Maybe next month you need 2-inch half square triangles. Well, you can't use the same pre-printed interfacing for both. So you're going to go buy a roll of the interfacing that makes 3-inch ones. And then, oh, well, you've got this left over and you're going to have to put it in your stash and go buy to make the 2-inch. It's just more cost effective to me to draw it yourself on 1/4-inch gridded graph paper. Also recommend that the largest size pieces of fabric that you use are fat quarters. Um, which means if you're making large half square triangles, you're not going to get very many on one fat quarter. But if you're making little half square triangles, you can get a whole lot on a fat quarter. The reason I recommend you don't do anything bigger than a fat quarter is it can get kind of bulky underneath your machine. And if you get one of those machines that only has like a little 4-inch neck, yeah, it's a little bulky. So that's my recommendation on sizing. Let's talk about some math. Remember that for half square triangles, you take the finished size of your half square triangle and you add 7/8 of an inch. So just remember that. Now, if you're doing this as the first step of 1/4 square triangles, again, it is the finished size plus 1 1/4 inches. Now, if you need to figure out how many grid squares to draw, add up how many total half square triangles do you need and divide that by 2. So in my example, I'm going to be making 3-inch half square triangles. So the grid measurement is going to be 3 7/8. So it's 3 plus 7/8. And I've decided that I'm going to make 24 of them. So 24 divided by 2 is 12. So I need to draw on my grid, I need to have a total of 12 3 7/8 inch squares on my grid. And that, line it up, it's going to end up being 4 across, 3 down. You'll see it as I draw it out. You'll see how that works out. My paper, I actually could have gone more half square triangles, but I thought 24 was enough. All right, so that is the math. Let us get on to, we'll start drawing it. and then we'll show you how it goes under the sewing machine. All right, so what size fabric do you cut to make your half squares on a grid? So you actually want your fabric to be ever so slightly larger than the total size of your grid. So for my 24 3-inch half square triangles, so it's going to be 12 squares, 4 across, 3 down, that are 3 and 7/8 inch. My total size of my grid is going to be 11 and 5/8 by 15 and a half. I'm cutting my fabric to a 12 by 16. Just it needs to be ever so slightly bigger than your total grid size.
So this is the graph paper that I'm using to draw my grid on. You do need to make sure that your graph paper is in 1/4 inch grid. You don't want metric. You don't want some architecture that's 10 to an inch. You want to make sure that you've got 1/4 inch grid. And you'll notice this pad is actually big enough that I could use the fat quarter size. This is a pretty big pad. And I just got this at my local office supply store. Now you need to draw your grid on your 1/4 inch graph paper using the calculations you made. I'm doing 3 and 7/8 inch squares. I need 12 of those squares to make 24 half square triangles. Once you get all the squares drawn, or maybe help you draw your squares, however you choose to do it, then you need to draw a single diagonal in each square. You'll notice I'm actually drawing my diagonals before I subdivide my squares, but it works. And then after you have all of your lines, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines drawn, take a look at a 2x2 grid of squares. Just kind of block off everything except the upper 2x2 grid. And this should look just like when you did the lines you drew on the back of your square when you did 8 at a time half square triangles. That's just a check. If you've done it right, that's what it should look like. Now grab another color of ink and draw your seam lines 1/4 inch on either side of the diagonal lines. I'd say another color so that you don't confuse yourself when you get to sewing. Again, you're going to need to cut one piece each of 2 different fabrics, which are slightly larger than the total size of your grid, and then stack the 2 pieces of fabric on top of each other, right sides together. Then place the grid paper on top of the fabric stack, making sure that all the grid lines are inside the edges of the fabric stack. Pin or baste the stack of grid paper and fabric to keep things from slipping. When I'm making a large number of half square triangles this way, I do prefer to hand baste one long basting stitch inside each triangle with a long continuous thread. This method has a lot of advantages over pins. Your fabric is going to stay flat, whereas pins, you're going to have little bumps and ripples. And if you're making tiny half square triangles and have a whole lot of pins, bumps and ripples, that's not good for sewing straight seams. There's also obviously no risk of stabbing yourself with a whole lot of pins throughout your fabric. You don't have to worry about sewing over or cutting over these basting threads. You can just sew and cut right across them and everything holds stable the whole process. You don't have to remove these basting threads until the very last step of the process. And it really doesn't take a whole lot longer to baste it like this than it would to actually put a pin in each triangle. Sew on the seam lines that you drew on your paper. Again, make sure you don't sew any vertical or horizontal lines. You're just going to sew on those diagonal seam lines that you drew. They are a 1/4 inch either side of the main diagonals, and hopefully you drew them in a different color. Just follow the path. Start in a corner, sew down across the whole grid till you get to the other edge. Turn things around. Where does it go to? Sew up that way. You don't even need to lift your needle if you just keep sewing around the path till you get back to the other end. you got one side sewn, now you got to sew the other side, sew that path. And then, depending on how the layout is, you may have one or maybe even two more paths to sew, but you just sew the paths. Cut your half square triangles apart by first cutting on the vertical and horizontal lines, including the outer edges of the grid, because remember your fabric is slightly larger than your grid, and then cut on the diagonal lines. Carefully remove the paper and the basting threads from the half square triangles. Open the half square triangles, press the seam allowances to one side, and trim the dog ears. If this is just step 1 of making quarter square triangles, now go on to step 2 of the quarter square triangle tutorial, which I will link below.
All right, well, I hope you have had fun learning to make a whole lot of half square triangles, lots more than two. It's an interesting way to do it. Uh, if you need to make a lot, to me, it doesn't necessarily, by the time you draw the grid and stuff, it may not save time, but it seems less tedious because you're not first cutting a whole lot of little teeny squares. That's my opinion. All right, I hope you have enjoyed learning how to do this. Thanks for watching. Make sure if you like this tutorial, go over on YouTube and give me a thumbs up so that YouTube knows that you liked it. And we will see you next time.